I've been battling with algae for basically my entire life, okay? Not really like the last 10 years of doing fish tank stuff, but for the most part, not a good relationship. And it's pretty obvious, but if your main goal is to set up display tanks, show tanks, like aquascape tanks, whatever you want to call them, then yeah, like algae is one of the #1 deterrents and things that kind of kills this thing that you put a bunch of time and money into. If you can't solve the problem, which happens sometimes, I mean, depending on the type of algae, it can be kind of a simple fix. There's a ton of different variables. But when algae gets the best of you, then it just really always isn't a good outcome. And it's something that I know a lot of people have a lot of problems with. It's kind of weird for me to say this, but that's starting to change. So if we come over here, the style of fish keeping that I'm kind of moving into, more of the actual fish keeping aspect of it, algae is actually kind of a super beneficial, awesome thing. And right now I am propagating it and hoarding it and using it to my advantage. So I think that's what we're gonna talk about today, is how I'm doing that, kind of the plans for how I'm gonna run this fish room and how I'm gonna use algae to hopefully make things safer for all my fish. I've been working on a ton of stuff lately, at least it seems like a ton of stuff. Got the upper part here framed in finally. Of course, the furnace did decide to go out again, so we pulled the guppies from downstairs in here. I put them in these little tubs just to try and keep them a little warmer because I didn't have a bunch of heaters to heat all those tanks. Didn't want these baby guppies to get down to like, I think, what did I clock one of the empty tanks at, like 62 this morning, so a little, like it's kind of on the fence for guppy happiness, right? Like we don't want to keep them in that cold of water for too long. Also kind of a science experiment to see how many of the babies would get eaten by these big females. I just didn't have the tanks to separate the two. That wouldn't be a problem if my freaking fish room was done. I'd have plenty of tanks to put things, but we're getting there. Anyway, enough of that, back to the algae. First off, we're not gonna only use algae in our fish holding tanks, guys, don't worry. You can see in some of the tanks that I already have set up, we have kind of a mix of some different plant species that are easy and, you know, a bunch of algae like this tank, and this tank. And it's a super easy thing to add to the little rice fish holding tubs up here. So this one's starting to develop a little bit of green water, love that. But some of these other ones, they just have like a big old clump of algae in it. And it's cool because algae basically does all the things that plants do, and they might actually even do it better in some circumstances. I say that because algae pretty much always grows good. Like plants, they don't always do too hot, and if a plant isn't growing, then it's not really contributing to the nutrient removal in the tank, the removal of metals and other things that like Diana Wallstad talks about in her awesome book that you should definitely check out. And I just feel like there could be a method to using algae like even instead of plants. I'm gonna do a hybrid of both. And you certainly can't say that algae does a better job at removing nitrate than, you know, a plant that is growing well in your tank could. But look, it's a green thing in the tank, and this algae particularly, I don't think looks super bad. So the other component of this is like, I'm kind of lucky in that I have a type of algae here that isn't a total eyesore. I'm sure you could imagine if like down here in the guppy tanks we had a ton of blackbeard algae, like that one particularly for me, I don't think I would be super happy with. I'm also not sure like if we could get the volume of it we'd need to actually do the job that we want. But this type of like kind of crazy string hair algae can just grow in mass. So this stuff is by no means completely taking over my tanks. It's more of just like an accessory thing. It's kind of like just having another plant in the tank. So it's not doing 100% of all the work that I want it to do to try and get me to the natural-esque, like very minimal water change ecosystem fish tank room that I want to have, but I think it's gonna play a significant role, or it could if I allowed it to. And I mean, look, algae is everywhere, and it's kind of an inevitability. We're gonna probably get it anyway, especially in tanks that we're not meticulously in all the time, so why not embrace it? I mean, this stuff literally grows on trees, right? Lichen, symbiotic relationship between a fungi and an algae. And like the stuff is literally airborne. Even sterile aquariums, or ones that you start out with that have no added things, like no contamination, you can still end up with algae. How does it get there? Also, I wanted to mention this, that the type of food that you feed into your aquarium can have an impact, or at least it seems like it does, on what type of algae populates itself in that tank. An example of both of these things, sterile aquariums then having algae, and then also the type of food you feed dictating what kind of happens in it, would be up here in the experiment tank. So I don't know, without getting too into it, we have a tank right here that just got legit fish food, and you can see like, I don't know, there's a little bit of algae here. We've had some of the brown kind of diatomaceous new tank algae on here before that we scraped off, but you can see this tank compared to this tank, which gets different type of food. This tank actually has some of that like green stringy algae. Maybe it has, I don't know, some thicker stuff here in the back. Whereas this tank doesn't seem to have it. It has a little bit of stuff on our fry hiding area. But then you come over to this tank, which had a completely different type of food. Same kind of setup where we started sterile, and we have like almost kind of like a weird blackbeard algae, or it's almost like the beginning stages of it before it turns into the tufts. I don't know. But again, different food, totally different outcome. Again, up here, we have legit fish food. We have a competitor brand right here. We had the same outcome this time though, where we got green water. There was a little bit of a timing difference in how that green water developed, but then over here into this tank, which got a completely different food, this was our control. This tank is now starting to finally develop green water after like, I don't even know how long. I'd have to look at my notes, but it's taken significantly more months of time, and we're still not even to this level of green that we have over here. Here's another example down here of different food, different algae. And my theory for why we sometimes see different algae pop up depending on the different food that's being fed is obviously the composition of the food, right? So when the fish eats the food, it gets digested. There's an amount that is undigested and left to kind of sit in the tank for bacteria to chew on, for algae to chew on. You of course will have undigested food a lot of the time that sits at the bottom. That's going to contribute to different levels of nutrients, and those different nutrient levels are going to dictate what grows in the tank, right? So over here, like with this food, maybe it's because it was overfed, maybe it's because it was more undigested than over here, and that's why this particular type of algae popped up. Like, there's so many factors, it's impossible to nail down exactly why. That's at least my running theory on the situation, but it makes sense. I don't think anybody could tell you how to get a particular type of algae over another one. I just don't think anybody has really investigated that before. I certainly don't know. I feel lucky that I have like the green stringy stuff over there in those tanks, and I don't have it anywhere else. Like I don't have it in my big tank. We're not developing it over here in this new aquarium, which is surprisingly extremely algae free for being like a week and a couple days in. Like this is the time where it starts to develop. Hasn't happened yet, so crossing my fingers. I don't know, we're starting to get a little bit of fuzz on the wood back there, some brown fungi growing, but as far as algae goes, kind of perfect. Haven't had to scrape the glass or anything, like nothing is growing in here. Hopefully that doesn't mean that the plants aren't growing, but yeah. And this particular type that I have is really easy to manage. That's not gonna be the case for all the different types of algae, right? Like there's probably hundreds of them. You're definitely gonna have a kind of like a set of algae that you probably tend to deal with more times than not. For me, it's mostly this green stringy type of algae, cyanobacteria, which I know isn't technically an algae, but we kind of classify it the same. And then just the default like green spot on the glass, which obviously I think in this context doesn't really count. The diatomaceous kind of like new tank syndrome algae that pops up, that's sort of like a temporary thing. So again, also doesn't really count. And honestly, like I feel lucky to say this, that those are basically the types of algae that I most commonly deal with these days. Like back at the old place, it was a different story. I would have a little bit of BBA now and again, but it didn't seem to really like my water parameters. And then, you know, I'm thinking back, like staghorn algae was another one that plagued one tank that I had really bad, and then it kind of spread and made its way to other tanks. But, you know, those were the two, I guess, bad ones that I wouldn't want to have in these tanks. There's just so many factors at play that it can be really tough to nail down. Like, what's your pH? What is the hardness of your water, right? The mineral content, specific nutrients, and the amount of those nutrients relative to the other factors. Like all of these things are prerequisites that enable them to take over and grow well in your tank. So I don't know, it's just kind of like an impossibility of variables, right? Like I bet you could take a tuft of blackbeard algae from one tank or several tufts of it and put it into an aquarium that maybe has like a half a unit of pH difference, and it just melts away, right? Like that's just a made up example. I really do think that that is kind of the level that we're dealing with here. Like I ran my theory on the green water by a few people, and they said like they had no problem growing it in soft water, but in 10 years of fish keeping, with soft water I never had green water one time. As soon as I started remineralizing the water and buffing that GH up a little bit, then I got green water, right? Like that can't be a coincidence. Or maybe it is, and I'm a crazy person. So I'm lucky that I have this type of algae for what I'm using it for, and I'm gonna hope it stays that way. Like if I wanna get in and completely remove this stuff, I totally can, because it doesn't really adhere much to anything. So that makes it kind of perfect for me. Like it will get kind of caught up in plants, and if they're not rooted really well, I have to be careful that I don't pull out any plants when I do that. But for the most part, I mean, boom, this stuff is gone. Or I can, if I want to, which I think I'm gonna do in this case, is just split it. So I have 2 chunks, and then take it up here and like put it in with the little koi fish, the koi rice fish. They'll like that. And I guess that's actually kind of working into the third reason, and that is that algae is just another really type of great microenvironment for tiny fish. I mean, just like plants would be. So like a lot of these tubs, they have Sylvinia floating in here with mixed results. Like it can be a little bit of a finicky plant, but same kind of deal. Like provides cover, provides a place for, you know, little microbes to be growing for them to chew on. And it just kind of grows like no matter what. It's honestly, it's like the easiest plant ever, okay? If I'm really trying to cope with the fact that my fish room is turning into an algae farm, right? It would be interesting to do an experiment with, you know, some amount of this algae compared to, I don't know, something like pearl weed or a clump and a clump that are kind of the same in weight. Like it'd be tough to measure that out. I guess you could measure the dry weight afterwards to really know if it was comparable, but just to see if the algae would be better or worse at absorbing things from the water, things like nitrate, like maybe phosphate, because we really don't know. I mean, all of this is like air quotes, in theory, on paper type of fish keeping, but I think that's what a lot of it is, honestly. It's gonna be super nice to get the sink working. Oh my gosh. I guess I'm not gonna be able to avoid this part of it because we're not gonna have like a proper water change system or anything in this fish room. Kind of doing it old school, but at least filling the tanks up will be a little bit easier, I think. This one's where you gotta be real careful not to suck up the baby rice fish. This tub's got some really little ones. That's why I check the bucket pretty much after every tub, at least when there's really small ones that you can miss really, really easily. That only really matters because we're trying to keep them so separate. We want to make sure that all the species or the subspecies are the same in each tub. So if I don't check and then I end up with a bunch of babies, then I don't know exactly which ones they are. Python is awesome because it's so little, but it gets plugged up super, super easily, which is annoying. Just trying to remove as much of the physical waste down at the bottom because it just collects over time. Like these are unfiltered systems with snails. So, I mean, fish poop isn't the most deadly thing in the world for the fish. Like, honestly, I have a lot less of a worry about it these days than I used to. That snail just shot out of there like a bullet. So I guess you do need to keep an eye on it, but it's not something to be totally freaked out about. Even if you don't have a substrate, like there's still plenty of microbes in all of these tubs. Like it's had months and months and months and months for those microbes to develop, like on the plastic, on the plants that are in here. Like there's still a decent amount of surface area in these things, even though there isn't any substrate. It's just something to, I guess, keep in mind. Like life will find a way. Biology will try its best to sort itself out, and it usually does. These tubs did take longer to cycle compared to other things that I have in the fish room, but they cycled nonetheless. Like, I mean, I guess just take a note from like the Lucas Brett style of keeping a fish room. I'm trying to kind of incorporate a little bit of that into my fish room as I build it out here, and you know, life will just figure it out. Like, it's not super important to do everything by the fish tank rule book. And there's certainly some things that you can kind of sidestep. You just got to keep up on knowing what's going on in the water. That's why we do a lot of test strips in this fish room. I'm a big fan of doing that because then we can know, like, you know, do we still have nitrite in this tank? Do we have any ammonia? Like, we don't, right? Because they are cycled. They cycled themselves eventually. It was just a longer fish in cycle than maybe what you would be used to. All right, water changes are done. Hopefully we can get that system a little bit easier. I honestly, like, I don't mind it. It's kind of it's almost a therapeutic experience. I'm being completely honest. Like, you know, if it was all automated, I feel like then I wouldn't have anything to do. But that's just me. I mean, it makes me feel good to do something good for my fish, to get those nitrate levels down with that nice, like, roughly 50% water change. And that's the only thing we have to worry about in these tanks is that nitrate buildup. Like, maybe over time, if we add more algae and plants, just kind of do like a mix to these bottom tanks, then it won't be so much of an issue. The tanks up here don't seem to accumulate as much, even though we're feeding basically the same amount. We have a few different types of fish. Obviously, the trout goodeids need to get up out of this 6-gallon tank and into a proper scape here pretty soon. They need some more room, but we're getting there. All the other fish are seeming to do good. Haven't had like any deaths or anything, like nothing crazy. Everybody's happy and healthy to my knowledge. And I see your comment. I know you're asking about the feeding rings. I've seen plenty of them. I know they're coming. Like, I don't have an ETA exactly. I thought I did originally. I'm trying to get rid of the last few bags of fish food that I have right now before the new shipment comes in, before we get the nano restocked finally, the 4-ounce bags. I know it's been super annoying, small business problems, but we're getting closer. Maybe not quite the end of this month, but definitely in April, everything will be back. Not sure if the feeding rings will be ready yet, but they will be coming shortly. I'm trying to put it on my priority list of things to do. Maybe I'll put a little YouTube viewer exclusive coupon code in here somewhere. You can check that out. And, you know, just thank you for helping support me on this journey that I've been on lately. I know it's been kind of all over the place, but hopefully we'll get some consistency back into the channel. I'm looking over here at these tub guppies that I think we need to add to this tank. I think these tub guppies are gonna really appreciate getting out of here. They've been in here for also way too long. So we'll introduce some life into this tank finally. Hopefully we'll be able to prevent some of the floating plants. Like, I don't know, most of that stuff looks dead. I think a snail got in there. That's okay. Like, it's an inevitability anyway, so why not do it now? These are some offspring from good old Kang Lee at Twin Cities Guppies. I think this was the red fire mosaic guppy. Forgive me, I know that's probably completely wrong, but got 2 males, 3 females, still coloring up. They're about, I don't know, what are they, close to 5 months old, I think, at this point. They're gonna cruise around in there, get used to their new tank. A lot better than the tub that they were in. I know, don't at me too hard, guys. I mean, it was either them or a bunch of rice fish, and this is definitely not a rice fish video, so hopefully you appreciate that. There's a chance you clicked on this video just because you're interested in learning about algae, not specifically what I'm doing it with it here. So I figured I'd talk a little bit about ways that you can prevent algae. Like, it's a very complicated topic, but if you are looking for easy methods to help, I guess, reduce the chances of transferring algae or getting a really bad algae problem, I have a little bit for you. The first big thing is going to be avoiding like really blatant contamination of things. So obviously don't accidentally dump a snail in with the fish that you're adding, right? If you're trying to not get snails. The same thing goes for algae. Like, if you're going to go work on a tank that has a really bad like cyanobacteria problem, don't take a big handful of it and transfer it over. These are super obvious things, right? But they're easy to overlook, especially when you're doing a bunch of things in a fish room like this. But like I mentioned a little earlier, if the parameters of the tank are different, then that can be all it is to prevent that algae from taking over. So that's a good thing, not something you can always rely on. If you want to go the extra mile, there's things that you can do. So you can buy tissue culture plants. They're expensive, I get it. That's one way to help prevent like directly introducing physical things into your tank, right? Because all plants that you get, They come from somewhere, they're in water, they're either in a farm or somebody, some business's tank before you get them. I don't think I've ever had too many bad problems in that department. I guess it's hard to tell, like right when you set up a tank, if you're using a bunch of fresh plants, it can be really hard to tell if your algae problem is because of those plants. But maybe there's something to say about this tank and the fact that we added mostly just tissue culture dwarf hairgrass as to why we don't have any algae issues popping up yet. I don't think that's the case. Like, we put plants from a tank inside in there. That algae hasn't taken over yet. It'll be interesting to see if this little green fuzzy algae takes over on this plant or not. But these are like little inevitabilities that you can't really do anything about. You can really go the extra mile and do like what I do on the experiment tanks, and that is to make sure that my hands aren't contaminating anything. Like, if I have to do anything in the tank, I wash my hands before, or spray them with hydrogen peroxide or a little bit of alcohol to try to kill everything. You can do the same thing with the utensils that you use, so like nets, tweezers, scissors, anything that's going from one tank to another. You just sterilize those things beforehand and hope for the best, right? But you always have to fight that sort of like airborneness, or just the random things that you have on your hand. Like, you could be transferring algae on your fingers. You're not going to remember to wash your hands every time you put your hand in a fish tank. Like, I think that's probably impossible. Those methods, while I think they're good to know and to use sometimes, I think they're probably kind of overkill. Like, in most cases, the inoculum is going to be so small that I don't think it really has a chance of turning a tank that doesn't have algae problems into one that does. Just wanted to throw that out there. Beyond that, it's really just, I think the main thing is light. So for all the other situations that just involve overall maintenance and the longevity of your aquarium, I think it's really just keeping the lighting at a level that isn't too much, which is easier said than done. Because aquarium LEDs these days, I think, my personal opinion, they're just way too overpowered. Like, do things like put them down on 35%. If they're one that you can modulate, try 25% and see how the plants do. That's gonna help to reduce the amount of things that can pop up in your tank, because algae really seems, at least in my opinion, to be very light dependent. Example is, of course, this tank. We've talked about it a bunch of times, but keeping the lighting very low and subdued in this aquarium, paired with plants that can handle that, of course, I think has been why this tank has been so successful. That, and the fact that we use a lot of floating plants, and they go through their ebb and their flow of me removing them and then letting them grow and take over the tank. And I just think that those two things are why this aquarium has been basically on cruise control, autopilot, whatever you want to say to describe it, for so long. Algae can definitely still grow if your lighting is low, if there's a bunch of excess nutrients. Like, a certain type of it is going to find a way to survive in those conditions. But as long as your plants are okay with the lower light levels, I think it's just going to help to increase the chances of you not having such explosive issues with it. But yeah, algae, I mean, hopefully we don't end up with it too bad in here. Hopefully we just didn't accidentally transfer the beginnings of an algae issue into this tank with those fish and the little bits of plants and water droplets that came with them. Algae will always be my nemesis no matter what. I'm not trying to get too comfortable with it, but I think embracing it a little bit with this aspect of the fish room is only going to be a beneficial thing, like, versus me getting in there and having to do a ton of extra work to try and keep everything algae free. I think this is probably just a better way to do it. And again, super fortunate that this is the algae issue that I have. Like, it's this particular type of algae. If it was something like staghorn or something like blackbeard algae, something that's a little less aesthetically pleasing, something that isn't really green like this stuff, then it would probably be a different story. But I mean, who knows? That's my take on it, like trying to adopt a little bit of the LR Brett style of things. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, like, go check out LRB Aquatics, his YouTube channel. You'll definitely see what I mean. But bringing in more kind of like natural, lax aspects of the fish keeping hobby versus like everything's super clean, everything's super perfect, everything is super filtered and air is in everything. Like, I know we just set up this air system that is hiding behind all of this, but we don't have air down here yet. I need to do that. Like, my pump is probably experiencing some not so fun back pressure issues. I don't think it's too much of an issue though. Everything seems to be working fine. The fish are happy. I know we need to step on the gas a little bit and get some of these fish moved and into their proper homes, but such is life. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's video, hanging out with me, doing some water changes in the fish room. I know it's not the most exciting thing in the world, but maybe next week it'll be another setup video. If I have a break in some of this stuff, like I'll have some time to really get this place looking a little bit better. And it's crazy. Like, I hope that I didn't show you all of the background mess. It's crazy. I'm rambling. Thanks again for watching, guys, and we'll see you next week.